In March of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its darkest hour. In that single month alone, German U-boats sent 120 Allied ships to the bottom of the ocean. Over 600,000 tons of vital supplies, food, weapons, and fuel vanished beneath the cold, gray waves. Winston Churchill himself would later confess that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. The numbers were staggering. At the height of their power, over 300 German submarines prowled the Atlantic, hunting in what they called wolf packs. Allied merchant sailors faced a 1 in 4 chance of dying at sea. Convoys that left Liverpool or New York often arrived with half their ships missing, their crews drowned in the freezing darkness thousands of miles from home. But there was one man who refused to accept these losses as inevitable. His name was Commander Arthur Brennan, and the tactics he developed would change the course of naval warfare forever. The British Admiralty initially banned his unconventional methods, dismissing them as reckless and dangerous. What happened next would prove them catastrophically wrong. This is the true story of the Ghost Convoy and the man who used it to sink 12 German U-boats when everyone said it couldn't be done. If you're fascinated by stories of courage, innovation, and defying the odds, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story from history's forgotten heroes. Arthur Brennan was born in 1903 in the small coastal town of Whitby, Yorkshire, where the smell of salt and fish had been part of daily life for centuries. The town clung to the cliffs like a memory, its narrow streets winding down to a harbor that had sheltered fishing boats since before the Vikings came. Arthur's earliest memories were of the sound of the sea, a constant companion that whispered through the cobblestone streets and rattled the windows of their small cottage on the hill. His father was a trawler captain, a weathered man who had spent 40 years pulling nets from the North Sea. William Brennan had hands like leather and eyes that seemed to look through storms to the calm waters beyond. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Young Arthur learned to read the ocean before he could read books, understanding the subtle shifts in wind and current that could mean the difference between a full hold and an empty one. The sea speaks to those who listen, his father told him one autumn morning as they stood on the pier watching the fishing fleet prepare for departure. Most men only hear the waves, but if you learn to listen, truly listen, you'll hear what the water is trying to tell you about what's coming. Arthur never forgot those words. He spent hours on the cliffs above Whitby, watching the patterns of the waves, learning to recognize the subtle changes in color and motion that preceded storms. By the time he was 12, local fishermen consulted him about weather conditions, trusting the boy's instincts over the official forecasts that arrived by telegram from London. By the time he was 16, Arthur had already survived 2 shipwrecks. The second one, a violent storm that claimed his father's vessel and 3 of its crew, left him with a scar across his left cheek and a profound understanding of the sea's merciless nature. It happened in November, when the North Sea turns cruel and the temperature drops below freezing. Arthur had begged his father to let him join the crew for the winter herring run, and William had reluctantly agreed. They were 3 days out when the storm struck. Arthur remembered the sky turning green, then black in the space of an hour. The waves rose higher than the mast, and the old trawler groaned like a wounded animal as it fought against the impossible force of the water. "Get below!" his father screamed over the roar of the wind. "Get below and seal the hatch." But Arthur couldn't move. He was frozen in terror, watching as a wall of water swept across the deck. He saw Thomas Murphy, a man who had worked for his father for 20 years, disappear over the side without even a cry. Then something struck him across the face, and everything went dark. He woke in a lifeboat, his father's arms wrapped around him, blood streaming from the gash on his cheek. 2 other survivors huddled beside them, praying silently as the tiny boat rose and fell on the mountainous swells. They drifted for 16 hours before a passing freighter spotted them and pulled them aboard. His father survived, but never fully recovered from the trauma of watching his friends disappear beneath the waves. He retired from the sea the following spring, taking a job at the fish market where he could still smell the salt without risking his life. The night terrors plagued him for years, and Arthur often heard him crying out in his sleep, calling the names of men who would never answer. "The ocean doesn't care about your plans," his father told him in the hospital, his voice hoarse from swallowing seawater. "It doesn't care about your hopes or your prayers. It only respects those who understand it better than they understand themselves." These words would shape everything Arthur Brennan would become. He joined the Royal Navy at 18, a lanky young man with intense gray eyes and a quiet demeanor that some mistook for shyness. His instructors quickly realized their error. Arthur possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate weather patterns and calculate the behavior of vessels in rough seas. Where other officers relied on instruments and charts, he seemed to operate on pure instinct. During his first year at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, Arthur distinguished himself in navigation and seamanship courses. His instructors noted his peculiar habit of spending hours staring at the water, watching the patterns of current and tide as if reading a book only he could understand. "Brennan sees things the rest of us miss," wrote Lieutenant Commander Jeffrey Adams in an evaluation. "I watched him predict a squall 2 hours before any instrument showed a change in pressure. When asked how he knew, he simply said, 'The water told him.' Unconventional, but remarkably effective." His rise through the ranks was steady but not spectacular. Arthur showed little interest in the politics and social maneuvering that often determined promotion in the peacetime Navy. He attended the required functions, wore the correct uniform, and said the appropriate things, but his heart was always on the bridge, watching the horizon. He served on destroyers and cruisers throughout the 1920s and 30s, gradually building a reputation as a reliable officer with an unusual gift for tactical thinking. His superiors found him difficult to categorize. He followed orders precisely, but had a habit of offering unsolicited suggestions that, while often correct, did not endear him to those who preferred unquestioning obedience. By 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, Arthur had risen to the rank of lieutenant commander. He was 36 years old, unmarried, and utterly dedicated to his profession. His superiors described him as brilliant but difficult, a man who questioned orders and challenged conventional wisdom at every opportunity. "Brennan doesn't respect authority," Admiral Harold Whitmore wrote in a fitness report. "He respects results." When war came, Arthur felt something shift inside him. The peacetime Navy had been frustrating, bound by tradition and reluctant to embrace new ideas. But war demanded innovation. War rewarded those who could think faster and more creatively than their enemies. For the first time in his career, Arthur felt that his peculiar talents might finally be put to proper use. The first years of the war were catastrophic for Allied shipping. German Admiral Karl Dönitz had developed the Wolfpack tactics to devastating effect. Groups of U-boats would spread across the convoy routes, with one submarine shadowing a convoy on the surface while radioing its position to others. When enough submarines had gathered, they would attack simultaneously at night, overwhelming the escort vessels and slaughtering the merchantmen. The tactics were devastatingly effective because they exploited fundamental weaknesses in Allied defenses. Submarines on the surface were nearly invisible at night and could travel faster than most merchant ships. Their low profile made them difficult to detect by radar, and the vast distances of the Atlantic meant that even when convoys were warned of U-boat presence, there was often nowhere safe to run. Dönitz had calculated that Germany needed to sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month to bring Britain to its knees. In the terrible winter of 1942-43, they came frighteningly close to achieving that goal. U-boats operated with near impunity, surfacing to attack and then disappearing into the endless gray expanse before escorts could respond. The Allies had few effective countermeasures. Radar was still in its infancy. Anti-submarine weapons were often unreliable. And the vast expanse of the Atlantic meant that air cover could only reach a fraction of the ocean. In what became known as the Black Gap, a stretch of mid-Atlantic beyond the range of land-based aircraft, convoys sailed for days without any protection from above. This gap became a hunting ground, where U-boats gathered like sharks around wounded prey. The human cost was staggering. Merchant sailors who survived torpedo attacks often died within minutes in the freezing water, their life jackets useless against the cold. Those who made it to lifeboats faced days or weeks adrift before rescue arrived, if it arrived at all. Many convoys lost so many ships that survivors outnumbered available rescue vessels, and men watched helplessly as their comrades drowned within sight of safety. Arthur Brennan was assigned to Western Approaches Command in Liverpool in early 1942. The city itself bore the scars of the Blitz, with entire blocks reduced to rubble and the smell of smoke still lingering in the air. But the docks remained operational, the lifeline that connected Britain to the supplies it desperately needed to survive. The headquarters of Western Approaches was a maze of underground bunkers beneath Derby House, a labyrinth of plotting rooms and communication centers where officers tracked the deadly chess game playing out across the Atlantic. Giant maps covered the walls, marked with pins representing convoys and U-boats. The pins moved by WRN's officers as reports filtered in from ships at sea. Arthur arrived on a rainy February morning, his sea bag over his shoulder and orders in his pocket. The duty officer who met him was harried and distracted, barely glancing at his credentials before directing him to the personnel office. "You're Brennan?" "Yes. Commander Hollis has been expecting you. Down the corridor, third door on the left. Mind the cables, we've had some electrical work done and nobody's cleaned up properly." His commanding officer was Captain Richard Hollis, a traditionalist who believed in established doctrine and distrusted innovation. Hollis was a veteran of the previous war, a man who had survived Jutland and believed that the lessons of that conflict still applied. His office was decorated with photographs of old battleships and framed commendations, the relics of a career built on following orders and never questioning superiors. "Your job is to escort convoys safely across the Atlantic," Hollis told him during their first meeting, "not to win medals or chase glory. We follow the established procedures and we do not deviate from them under any circumstances." Arthur nodded, but his mind was already racing with questions. The established procedures were failing. Ships were dying by the dozens. Something had to change. He wanted to argue, to point out that blindly following doctrine was costing lives, but he recognized the futility of such a confrontation. Hollis was not a man who welcomed debate. "Yes, sir, I understand perfectly." Hollis studied him for a moment, as if sensing the defiance beneath the obedient words. "I've read your file, Brennan. You have a reputation for being somewhat unorthodox. I'm warning you now, that sort of behavior will not be tolerated in this command. We have systems that work. Your job is to implement them, not to improve them." "Of course, sir." But even as he spoke the words, Arthur knew he could not accept them. The systems were not working. Every day, more ships sank, more men died. And somewhere in the gray Atlantic waters, the U-boats circled, like wolves, waiting for their next kill. His first convoy command was SC-94, a slow convoy of 32 merchant ships crossing from Halifax to Liverpool in August of 1942. Arthur was given command of the escort group, 4 corvettes and a single destroyer, tasked with protecting vessels carrying wheat, timber, and ammunition. Before departure, Arthur visited several of the merchant vessels, an unusual practice for convoy escort commanders. He wanted to understand the men he was protecting, their capabilities and limitations, their fears and hopes. He found them to be a diverse lot, British and Canadian and Norwegian, professional sailors and wartime volunteers, united only by the knowledge that they were sailing into mortal danger. "You're the Navy man who's supposed to keep us alive?" asked Captain Henrik Olsen of the Norwegian freighter Nordvik, his weather-beaten face creased with skepticism. "No offense, Commander, but the last 3 escorts I've sailed with didn't do much keeping." "I can't promise miracles," Arthur replied honestly. "But I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to bring your ship through, and I'd appreciate any observations you can share about U-boat behavior. You've seen more of them than I have." Olsen studied him with new interest. "Most Navy officers don't ask merchantmen for advice. Most Navy officers haven't lost as many ships as we have. I'm willing to learn from anyone who can teach me." That conversation, and dozens like it, would prove invaluable in the days to come. Arthur learned that the merchant sailors had their own wisdom about submarine behavior, knowledge gained through bitter experience that rarely made it into official reports. The convoy had barely cleared Canadian waters when the first U-boat found them. Arthur was on the bridge of HMS Harbinger when the lookout spotted the periscope wake at dawn. "Submarine bearing 045, range approximately 2,000 yards, the lookout called. Standard doctrine dictated an immediate attack. Chase the submarine down, force it to dive, drop depth charges, and hope for the best." But Arthur hesitated. Something felt wrong. "All stations, hold your positions," he ordered. His executive officer, Lieutenant James Crawford, stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, we need to attack. That submarine will signal the others and we'll have a wolf pack on us by nightfall." "I know," Arthur said quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant periscope. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." Crawford's face went pale. "Sir? Think about it, James. One submarine finds us, signals the pack, and they gather for a night attack. That's their pattern. But what if we could use that pattern against them?" "I don't understand, sir." Arthur finally turned from the window, his expression intense. "We know they're coming. We know when they prefer to attack. We know how they coordinate. What if instead of waiting to be ambushed, we became the ambushers?" That night, Arthur implemented what he called the honeypot maneuver. Instead of keeping the convoy tightly packed for mutual protection, he deliberately spread the ships out, creating the appearance of a disorganized, vulnerable target. Meanwhile, he positioned his escort vessels in a wide perimeter, engines silenced, waiting in the darkness. His officers thought he had lost his mind. Lieutenant Crawford pulled him aside as darkness fell, his face pale with concern. "Sir, with all due respect, this goes against everything we've been taught. Spreading the convoy makes individual ships more vulnerable. If the wolf pack attacks, we won't be able to protect them all." "You're right," Arthur said quietly. "We can't protect them all. We've never been able to protect them all. But think about it, James. The U-boats attack at night because they expect us to be defending, not attacking. They expect us to be reactive. What if we became proactive instead?" "I don't understand." "Sir, the submarines will surface to attack. They always do at night. It's faster and more accurate. When they surface, they're vulnerable. If we know approximately when and where they'll appear, we can be waiting for them." Crawford was silent for a long moment. "You're using the convoy as bait." "I'm using the convoy's appearance as bait. There's a difference. The U-boats won't actually attack undefended ships. They'll attack what they think are undefended ships, and we'll be there to meet them." It was a desperate gamble, the kind of tactical improvisation that either won medals or court-martials. Arthur knew the risks. If he was wrong, if the U-boats behaved differently than expected, the convoy would suffer catastrophic losses. His career would be over, and worse, men would die because of his arrogance. But he also knew that the alternative was slow defeat. The standard tactics were failing. Something had to change, and he was willing to be the one who changed it. The wolf pack struck at 0200 hours, exactly as Arthur had predicted. But instead of finding a sleeping convoy, they found a trap. The first U-boat to surface for its attack run was caught in the crossfire of two corvettes. Depth charges bracketed the submarine before it could dive, and the resulting explosion lit up the night sky. Two more U-boats were damaged before the pack realized what was happening and fled into the darkness. SC-94 lost only 3 merchant ships, a remarkable achievement considering the circumstances. When Arthur returned to Liverpool, Captain Hollis was not pleased. "You deviated from standard doctrine," Hollis said, his face red with anger. "You deliberately put your convoy at risk with this experimental nonsense." "With respect, sir, we lost 3 ships. The average for convoys facing wolf pack attacks is 12 to 15. I'd call that a success." "I call it luck, and luck runs out, Commander. You will follow established procedures from now on, or I will have you removed from command. Is that clear?" Arthur saluted and left without another word. But his mind was already working on something bigger, something that would make the honeypot look like a children's game. For the next 6 months, Arthur studied every U-boat attack in the Atlantic. He pored over reports, interviewed survivors, and spent countless hours with meteorologists and oceanographers. He commandeered a small office in the basement of Derby House, filling it with charts, photographs, and analysis until the walls disappeared beneath layers of data. His colleagues thought he was obsessing to the point of madness. He slept only 4 hours a night, ate at his desk, and seemed to exist in a world of his own, muttering about patrol patterns and diving times while others discussed shore leave and rationing. Lieutenant Crawford found him one evening surrounded by stacks of reports, his eyes red from exhaustion, but burning with intensity. "Sir, you need to rest. You've been at this for 3 days straight." "I'll rest when I understand them," Arthur replied without looking up. "Every attack follows a pattern, James. Every commander has habits. Dönitz is brilliant, but he's also systematic. He believes in his methods completely, trusts them without question. That's what will destroy him." He began to see patterns that others had missed, connections between water temperature, visibility, moon phases, and U-boat behavior. The German submarines were not random predators. They were creatures of habit, constrained by their own tactics and the limitations of their technology. They preferred to attack on moonless nights. They avoided areas with strong currents that made torpedo calculations difficult. They surfaced to recharge their batteries on predictable schedules. Arthur realized that the U-boats were, in a sense, predictable. Not individually, but as a system. And any system could be exploited. He developed his theory in secret, sharing it only with a small group of trusted officers. Chief among them was Lieutenant Crawford, who had become a true believer after the SC-94 success, and Lieutenant Commander Elizabeth Ashworth, a WRNS officer who worked in the intelligence section and had access to decoded German naval communications. "The key is deception," Arthur explained during a late-night meeting in a cramped office. "Right now, we react to the U-boats. We wait for them to find us, then we defend ourselves. But what if we could make them react to us instead?" Elizabeth spread a chart across the desk. "We've been tracking their patrol patterns based on intercepts. They concentrate their forces where they expect convoys to be. But those expectations are based on our shipping schedules, which they've largely figured out." "Exactly," Arthur said, jabbing his finger at the chart. "So we give them false information. We create convoys that don't exist, sailing routes that lead nowhere, transmitting signals that make them think valuable targets are where no ships actually are." "Ghost convoys," Arthur agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "We make them chase shadows while our real ships slip through the gaps. We turn their own system against them." Elizabeth leaned forward, her analytical mind already working through the implications. The deception would need to be sophisticated. German intelligence is excellent, and they've broken enough of our codes to know what real convoy communications sound like. If the phantom ships don't sound authentic, they'll see through it immediately. "That's why we need your help," Arthur said. "You know what real signals look like. You know what the Germans expect to intercept. We need to create perfect forgeries, communications that are indistinguishable from the real thing." The concept was elegant but extremely risky. Creating convincing phantom convoys required sophisticated radio deception, precise timing, and the cooperation of multiple commands. Any mistake could expose the real convoys to even greater danger. "There's another problem," Crawford said slowly. "Even if we fool them initially, they'll eventually realize what's happening. Submarine commanders will report that the convoys they attacked disappeared without sinking. Dönitz will notice the discrepancy." "You're right," Arthur acknowledged. "We probably have a window of a few months at most before they adapt. That's why we need to make every operation count. Every submarine we destroy is one less threat to real convoys." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring at the charts spread across the desk. "You're proposing that we use deception not just to protect convoys, but to actively hunt submarines, turn defense into offense." "Exactly. Instead of waiting for them to find us, we draw them to where we want them. On our terms, at our chosen time and place. The three of them sat in silence, each contemplating the magnitude of what they were discussing. If it worked, it could change the entire course of the Battle of the Atlantic. If it failed, it could result in catastrophic losses and the court-martial of everyone involved. Arthur prepared a detailed proposal and submitted it to Captain Hollis. The response came 3 days later, a single-page memorandum stamped "Rejected" in red letters. "Impractical and dangerous," Hollis wrote. "This scheme would waste valuable resources and risk compromising our communication security." Commander Brennan is reminded that his duty is to execute established doctrine, not to invent alternatives. Arthur was devastated. He had spent months developing the Ghost Convoy concept, and now it was being dismissed without even a proper review. He considered resigning his commission, walking away from a Navy that seemed determined to lose the war through sheer stubbornness. It was Elizabeth who convinced him to try another approach. "Hollis isn't the only voice in the Admiralty," she said. "There are others who are looking for new ideas. Let me make some inquiries." 2 weeks later, Arthur received an unexpected summons to London. He was to meet with Rear Admiral Patrick Keyes, the head of the newly formed Anti-U-Boat Division. Keyes had a reputation for unconventional thinking and had personally championed several experimental programs, including early radar development. The journey to London took Arthur through a country transformed by war. From the train window, he watched factories churning out weapons around the clock, their chimneys belching smoke into gray skies. Women operated machinery that had once been considered too dangerous for them, their faces grim with determination. Children played in the rubble of bombed buildings, adapting to a world where destruction was simply part of daily life. Britain was holding on, but barely. The food rationing had grown more severe, and Arthur saw the signs of malnutrition in the faces of civilians waiting at train stations. Every ship that made it across the Atlantic was another week of survival. Every ship that sank was another step toward defeat. The meeting took place in a windowless office deep within the Admiralty building. Security was tight, with armed guards at every checkpoint and identification verified multiple times. Whatever Keyes was doing down here, it was clearly important. Keyes himself was a small man with sharp eyes and a habit of tapping his pen against the desk while he thought. His office was Spartan, decorated only with a single photograph of a destroyer and a map of the Atlantic, covered in pins and colored string. "I've read your proposal," he said without preamble. "It's either brilliant or insane. Possibly both." Arthur stood at attention. "I believe it could work, sir. Our current tactics are failing. We're losing this battle through attrition, and time is not on our side." "I'm aware of the situation, Commander." Keyes stopped tapping his pen and leaned forward. "In the past month alone, we've lost 92 ships. Do you know what that means in human terms? Over 2,000 sailors dead, most of them drowned in the dark, screaming for help that never came. The merchant fleet is approaching breaking point. If losses continue at this rate, we won't have enough ships to supply Britain by summer. Which is exactly why we need to try something different, sir." Keyes studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Tell me honestly, Commander, what do you need to prove this concept?" Arthur had prepared for this moment. 3 destroyers, 6 corvettes, and complete operational independence for 60 days. I'll also need access to the decryption intelligence and cooperation from Coastal Command for aerial reconnaissance. That's a significant commitment of resources. The average convoy loses 8 to 10 ships per crossing. If my tactics can reduce that by even half, the mathematics speak for themselves. Keyes studied him for a long moment. "Your commanding officer thinks you're a dangerous maverick. With respect, sir, Captain Hollis thinks anyone who questions doctrine is dangerous. I think it's more dangerous to keep doing what clearly isn't working." A thin smile crossed Keyes's face. "I'm giving you 45 days, not 60. And I'm assigning you 4 destroyers instead of 3, HMS Vengeance, HMS Relentless, HMS Stalwart, and HMS Dauntless. The corvettes will be assigned as available. Your operations will be classified, reported directly to me, bypassing Western Approach's command." Arthur felt his heart racing. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "See that you don't, Commander. A lot of good men are depending on you." Keyes handed him a sealed envelope. "Your orders. Report to Londonderry in 48 hours. And Brennan, if this works, you'll be a hero. If it fails, you'll be court-martialed and your career will be over. Make sure you understand what you're risking." "I understand completely, sir." The journey to Londonderry took Arthur through a Britain battered by war but unbroken in spirit. He watched from the train window as factories churned out weapons, as women drove trucks and operated cranes, as children played in the rubble of bombed buildings. These people were counting on the supply convoys to keep them alive. Every ship that reached port meant food on tables and fuel for the furnaces. Every ship that sank meant another family going hungry, another factory going dark. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had been given the chance he'd asked for. Now he had to deliver. His new command assembled at Londonderry over the following week. The 4 destroyers were all veterans of convoy duty, their crews experienced but exhausted from the endless months of combat. Arthur met with each ship's captain individually, explaining his concepts and gauging their reactions. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Reed of HMS Vengeance was skeptical but professional. Commander Harold Sterling of HMS Relentless was openly enthusiastic, having lost his brother to a U-boat attack the previous year. Lieutenant Commander Alan Foster of HMS Stalwart asked penetrating questions that showed a sharp tactical mind. And Lieutenant Commander David Price of HMS Dauntless, the youngest of the 4, expressed concerns about the risks but acknowledged that current tactics were failing. "Gentlemen," Arthur addressed them at their first group meeting, "what I'm about to tell you must not leave this room. We are going to create a phantom fleet, ghost convoys that will draw the U-boats away from our real shipping while we hunt them with maximum aggression." He laid out his plan in detail. They would use radio deception to create the illusion of multiple convoys sailing parallel routes. False signals would simulate merchant ships, complete with the casual unencrypted chatter that characterized real convoy communications. Meanwhile, the real convoy would sail on an unexpected route, escorted by minimal forces, while the bulk of their destroyers lurked near the phantom convoy, waiting for U-boats to take the bait. "The key is patience," Arthur explained. "We cannot attack at the first sign of contact. We must wait until multiple submarines have committed to the attack before we spring the trap. This will be the hardest part. We will hear their torpedoes running, we will know they are closing in, and we will hold our fire until the perfect moment." Sterling nodded grimly. "And if the deception fails, if they realize the ghost convoy isn't real before they commit, then we improvise. But the intelligence suggests they're confident in their current tactics. They expect us to be predictable. That expectation is their weakness." The first operation launched on a foggy morning in November. The real convoy, designated On 104, consisted of 43 merchant ships bound for Halifax. Standard doctrine would have sent them on the established northern route, heavily escorted and expecting attack. Instead, Arthur split his forces. 2 corvettes accompanied the real convoy on a southern route that swung far below the usual shipping lanes. It was longer and consumed more fuel, but it passed through waters the U-boats rarely patrolled because they believed no convoys would be there. Meanwhile, the ghost convoy sailed the northern route. Arthur personally commanded the deception from HMS Vengeance, transmitting false signals that painted a picture of a large, slow convoy struggling through heavy weather. The transmissions included simulated distress calls, reports of engine trouble, and the mundane chatter of bored merchantmen. For 2 days, nothing happened. Arthur barely slept, monitoring the radio room constantly, waiting for any sign that the deception was working. On the 3rd night, Elizabeth's intelligence contact sent a coded message. German radio traffic indicated at least 6 U-boats converging on the ghost convoy's supposed position. Donitz himself had ordered the concentration, expecting a rich haul of supplies. "They're coming," Arthur announced to his assembled captains. Estimated contact in 8 hours. All ships to action stations at 0400. The hours that followed were among the most tense of Arthur's life. His small force waited in total darkness, engines at minimum power, all non-essential systems shut down to reduce their acoustic signature. The U-boats would be listening for any sign of their prey. At 0530, the first submarine surfaced, then another, and another. Arthur counted 5 conning towers rising from the black water, their crews confident that they were about to slaughter a helpless convoy. All ships, this is Harbinger. Arthur transmitted on the short-range tactical frequency. Execute Plan Alpha. On my mark. He waited 10 more agonizing seconds as the submarines spread out into attack formation. Mark! 4 destroyers surged out, of the darkness at flank speed. Starshells burst overhead, illuminating the scene in harsh white light. The U-boats were caught completely by surprise, their deck guns unmanned, their crews still believing they were the hunters. HMS Relentless reached the nearest submarine in under a minute, her depth charges already rolling off the stern. The explosion lifted the U-boat's bow clear of the water, and she began to sink immediately. HMS Stalwart caught another submarine in the act of diving, dropping a perfect pattern that ruptured its pressure hull. The remaining 3 submarines managed to crash dive, but Arthur had anticipated this. He had spent months studying the diving characteristics of Type 7 U-boats, and he knew exactly how long they needed to reach safe depth. His destroyers were already moving to intercept, their ASDIC operators tracking the fleeing submarines with grim determination. By dawn, the battle was over. 2 U-boats had been sunk outright. A third had been damaged so severely that it was forced to surface and surrender. A fourth was believed destroyed based on the oil slick and debris field, though this could not be confirmed. The Ghost Convoy had claimed its first victims. When Arthur returned to Londonderry, he found a message waiting from Admiral Keyes. 2 words: continue operations. Over the following 6 weeks, Arthur refined and expanded his tactics. Each operation taught him something new about U-boat behavior, and each success made his crews more confident and capable. The second Ghost Convoy operation caught 3 submarines in the Bay of Biscay. The third destroyed 2 more off the coast of Iceland. By the time Keyes's original 45-day deadline arrived, Arthur's task force had confirmed kills on 8 U-boats, with 3 more probables. More importantly, the real convoys that sailed while the Ghosts drew attention suffered dramatically reduced losses. Merchant ships that would have been torpedoed arrived safely at port, their cargoes intact. For the first time since the war began, the tide seemed to be turning. But Arthur knew that success brought its own dangers. The Germans would eventually realize what was happening, they would adapt their tactics, and he would need to stay ahead of them. The intelligence reports confirmed his fears. Dönitz was suspicious. Several U-boat commanders had reported that the convoys they attacked seemed to vanish without sinking, their wreckage never found. The admiral had ordered a review of all recent operations, looking for patterns that might explain the anomaly. "We have perhaps another month before they figure it out," Elizabeth warned during a briefing. "After that, the Ghost convoys will be worthless." Arthur stared at the charts covering his office wall. "Then, we make this month count. One last operation, something big enough to break their offensive capability in the North Atlantic." He developed the most ambitious plan of his career. Instead of a single Ghost convoy, he would create 3 simultaneous Phantoms, spreading German forces across hundreds of miles of ocean, while the real convoys sailed, protected through the gaps. At the same time, his destroyers would hunt aggressively, seeking out the scattered U-boats before they could regroup. It was incredibly risky. If anything went wrong, if the Germans saw through even one of the deceptions, multiple convoys would be exposed to attack. Arthur would be gambling not just his career but hundreds of lives on the success of the plan. Admiral Keyes approved the operation with a single condition. Arthur would have to coordinate with Coastal Command for extended air support, which meant briefing additional personnel on the classified tactics. Security would be compromised, but the potential gains justified the risk. The operation began on January 15, 1943. 3 phantom convoys materialized in German reconnaissance reports, each apparently carrying vital supplies to different destinations. Dönitz committed over 20 submarines to the intercepts, spreading his forces thin across the North Atlantic. Arthur's task force, now expanded to 6 destroyers and 8 corvettes, positioned themselves at the convergence points. Meanwhile, 2 real convoys carrying over 100 merchant ships between them sailed alternate routes with minimal escorts. The first contact came at 1600 hours on the second day. HMS Dauntless detected a submarine shadowing what it believed was a straggling merchant ship. Lieutenant Commander Price executed a textbook attack, destroying the U-boat with a single depth charge pattern. Over the next 72 hours, the operation became a running battle across 500 miles of ocean. Arthur coordinated his forces through a combination of radar intercepts, ASDIC contacts, and intelligence reports, directing destroyers to intercept submarines as they gathered for attacks that would never come. The decisive engagement occurred on January 18th. 4 U-boats had converged on Ghost Convoy 3, unaware that they were sailing into a trap. Arthur had positioned 3 destroyers in a triangle around the Phantom Convoy's supposed location, with his own HMS Vengeance holding the center. He stood on the bridge in total darkness, every light extinguished, the ship silent except for the gentle lap of water against the hull. Beside him, the radar operator called out contacts in a whisper, tracking the submarines as they approached. First contact, bearing 190, range 4,000 yards. Second contact, bearing 225, range 3,500. Third contact, bearing 270, range 5,000. Hold positions, Arthur ordered, his voice calm despite the tension that gripped his chest. Wait for the fourth. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Arthur could hear the breathing of his bridge crew, could feel their nervousness, radiating through the darkness. They had trained for this moment, practiced the maneuvers 100 times, but nothing could truly prepare a man for combat against an enemy he could not see. Fourth contact, bearing 315, range 4,200. Arthur allowed himself a small smile. All 4 submarines were committed, spread out in the attack formation that Dönitz had perfected. They expected to find a convoy of defenseless merchant ships. Instead, they would find death. At 0300, the submarines began their surface approach. Arthur waited until all 4 were committed before giving the order. The battle that followed was short and brutal. 2 submarines were destroyed in the first minute, caught in overlapping depth charge patterns. A third attempted to flee on the surface and was raked by gunfire from HMS Relentless, killing most of its bridge crew and forcing a surrender. The fourth managed to dive but was hunted for 6 hours until its batteries were exhausted and it was forced to surface. When the operation concluded, Arthur's forces had destroyed 12 confirmed U-boats, the largest single victory against the German submarine fleet since the war began. The 2 real convoys arrived at their destinations with only 4 ships lost, a casualty rate far below the average. The news reached Churchill himself, who demanded a full briefing on the Ghost Convoy tactics. Arthur was summoned to London once again, this time to address a room full of admirals, generals, and government officials. "Commander Brennan," Churchill said, his famous cigar clenched between his teeth, "you have accomplished something remarkable. How did you do it?" Arthur stood at attention, aware that his entire future hung on this moment. "I listened to the ocean, sir, and I learned that our enemy, for all his cunning, was predictable. Once I understood his patterns, I could exploit them. And the cost? What did we lose in achieving this victory? 1 corvette damaged, sir. No ship sunk, 17 men wounded, none killed." Churchill was silent for a long moment. "You have changed the course of this war, Commander. The Battle of the Atlantic is not yet won, but thanks to you, we now know it can be won." Arthur returned to Londonderry to find his crews celebrating. The news of their success had spread despite the classification, and the men who had risked their lives in the Phantom convoys were being hailed as heroes. But Arthur felt no triumph. He walked alone to the harbor wall, staring out at the gray Atlantic that had consumed so many lives. He thought of his father, the old trawler captain who had taught him to read the sea. He thought of the merchant sailors who had drowned in their thousands while he developed his tactics. He thought of the German submariners, many of them barely more than boys, who had died because of his deception. Crawford found him there, as the sun began to set. "You should be celebrating, sir. We won." "We won this battle," Arthur replied. "The war continues, and somewhere out there, Dönitz is already planning his response. The ghost convoys will become known. The Germans will adapt. We will have to adapt faster. Then we will. You've proven it can be done." Arthur nodded slowly. "Perhaps. But I've also proven something else. War is not just about weapons and tactics. It's about understanding your enemy as a human being, predicting his choices before he makes them. That knowledge comes at a price." "What price, sir?" Arthur turned to face his executive officer. "The price of knowing that every victory means someone's sons and fathers are not coming home. German or British, they're all sailors. They all loved the sea. And now they sleep at the bottom of it, because I was better at this terrible game than their commanders." Crawford had no answer to that. They stood together in silence as the last light faded from the sky. The ghost convoy tactics would continue to evolve throughout 1943 and 44. Other commanders adopted and adapted Arthur's methods, refining them with new technology and expanded intelligence. The Battle of the Atlantic gradually turned in the Allies' favor. The U-boat threat contained and eventually defeated. Arthur Brennan was promoted to captain and given command of an entire escort group. He continued to serve until the war's end, participating in the liberation of Europe and the final defeat of Nazi Germany. His contributions were recognized with the Distinguished Service Order and the American Legion of Merit. But he never forgot the cost of his victories. In his private journal, found after his death in 1978, he wrote, "We remember the ships we saved, the convoys that made it through. We count our victories in tonnage delivered and submarines destroyed. But the sea keeps different records. It remembers every soul it has claimed, Allied and German alike. When I close my eyes, I can still hear them calling out across the waves." The ghost convoy remained classified until 1972, when naval historians finally pieced together the full story from declassified documents and survivor interviews. By then, Arthur had retired to his hometown of Whitby, where he spent his final years walking the same cliffs where his father had taught him to love the sea. He never married, he never wrote a memoir. He refused all requests for interviews, saying only that the men who died deserved their peace, and he would not disturb it for fame or money. But those who served with him never forgot. At his funeral, over 200 veterans gathered on the Whitby Pier, many of them traveling from across the world to pay their respects. They stood in silence as his ashes were scattered on the tide, returning him to the ocean that had defined his life. Lieutenant Commander Elizabeth Ashworth, who had risen to become one of the Royal Navy's first female intelligence directors, delivered the eulogy. "Arthur Brennan saved thousands of lives," she said. "He changed the course of history. But if you asked him what he was most proud of, he would tell you it was the ships that came home, the sailors who returned to their families, the children who grew up because their fathers survived. He never sought glory. He only sought to bring his people safely through the storm. And in the end, that is what he did. Not through magic or luck, but through patience, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to those who depended on him. The sea has taken him back now, but his legacy lives on in everyone who refuses to accept that the impossible cannot be done." The crowd dispersed slowly, old men helping older men, sharing memories of battles fought 60 years before. The sun set over the North Sea, painting the water gold and crimson, and somewhere in the depths, the ghosts of 100 ships kept their eternal watch. Arthur Brennan had spent his life fighting shadows. In the end, he became one himself, a whisper in naval history books, a legend among those who study the forgotten corners of the Second World War. But his tactics, his innovations, and his courage continue to influence military thinking to this day. The Ghost Convoy was more than a deception. It was a revolution in how nations think about warfare, proving proving that creativity and intelligence can triumph over brute force, that understanding your enemy is more powerful than any weapon. And it all began with a young man from Yorkshire who listened to his father's words and never forgot them. The ocean doesn't care about your plans. It only respects those who understand it better than they understand themselves. Arthur Brennan understood. And because of that understanding, thousands lived who would otherwise have died. Convoys arrived that would otherwise have been lost, and a war that seemed unwinnable was finally won. His story reminds us that heroes don't always wear medals or lead armies. Sometimes they sit in cramped offices, studying charts and intercepted messages, looking for patterns that everyone else has missed. Sometimes they take risks that their superiors condemn, trusting their instincts when doctrine has failed. Sometimes they save the world in ways that no one will know about for decades. Arthur Brennan was such a hero. The sea has claimed him now, as it claims all sailors eventually. But his ghost still sails the Atlantic, watching over the ships that pass through waters he made safe, protecting the crews who will never know his name. And somewhere in the depths, the U-boats he destroyed rest in their iron graves, monuments to a conflict that consumed millions of lives and reshaped the modern world. They sleep in darkness now, but they are not forgotten. The men who served on both sides, who fought and died in the cold gray waters, deserve to be remembered. That is the true lesson of the Ghost Convoy. Not how to deceive an enemy, but how to honor those who serve. Arthur Brennan understood that lesson better than anyone. He carried it with him every day of his life, through victory and loss, through celebration and grief. He was not a perfect man. He made mistakes, misjudgments, decisions that cost lives, but he never stopped trying to do better, to save more, to bring his people home. In the end, that dedication was his greatest achievement. The waves still roll across the Atlantic, as they have for millions of years. Ships still sail the routes that Arthur Brennan made safe, carrying goods and passengers and dreams across the vast expanse of water. Most of them have never heard of the Ghost Convoy. Most of them will never know how close the Allies came to losing the Battle of the Atlantic. But the sea remembers. It always remembers. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through history. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who appreciates tales of courage and ingenuity. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Until next time, remember that history is not just about the famous names and the big battles. It's about the quiet heroes who changed everything, the ones who refused to accept defeat, who saw possibilities where others saw only obstacles. Arthur Brennan was one of those heroes, and now you know his story. The Atlantic is calm today. The ghosts are at peace.